Good morning, students. Welcome to the course on Foundations of Cognitive Robotics. In the last class, I have told you about the mathematical modeling of a neuron. I told you that how, with the help of the classical Hodgkin-Huxley model, we can actually mathematically model the action potential of a neuron. Now, today we will go beyond this. Today we will talk about how we can have some of the most recent theories to explain these kind of propagation of action potential. So let's look into that. What will be the outline of today's lecture? Today we are first going to talk about the Hodgkin-Huxley model summary so that you can summarize, and then we will talk about that what are the properties which is still unexplained by the Hodgkin-Huxley model. And then we will talk about the development of a new model. We'll then talk about the wave equations, the development of solitons, and the significance of the bi-lipid layer membrane, piezoelectric modeling, and a co-propagation model. So these are the things that we will discuss today. So first of all, let us try to summarize the Huxley-Hodgkin's model. The H-H model, in a nutshell, it starts with some of the key equations. The first equation that I told you is that it's the membrane current equation. So here the neurons are considered as kind of an assembly of capacitors and resistors. So in that neuronal circuit, and also the cell itself as a kind of a source of potential or a battery. So the neuronal current, which is actually the membrane current, is IMT, and Cm is the membrane capacitance, and Vm is the membrane voltage. Now Gna is the conductance with respect to sodium channel, Gk is the conductance with respect to potassium channel, and Gl takes care of the leakage current, which is mainly with chloride and other ion channels. So one thing you have to keep in our mind here, that we are representing the resistance in terms of conductance G, which is actually 1 over the R. So it is the reciprocal of the resistance that we have to keep in our mind. Okay. So just like we write, say for example, when in terms of current, if we have to write, then it will help us, because we write usually current as what? Current we write as V over R, and in this case we will write it, the current, as what? We will write it as G times V, conductance times the voltage. So that's the difference that we have to keep in our mind. And of course the other part of the current that's related to the capacitor, that is remaining the same, because it is in relation to the capacitance, and that is Cm dV dt. Now the other important thing that I had discussed in the last class is that these conductance, like the conductance of sodium, conductance of potassium, it is found experimentally by Huxley-Hodgkins is that they actually vary with respect to certain gate opening, and they found out that there are essentially 3 types of gates. For sodium, it is 3 types of M gate and 1 type of H gate. So 3 type of M and 1 H gate. This actually controls the conductance. And for potassium, This is actually 4 types of AND gates which actually control the conductance of the potassium. Now if there are 3 of the M gates and if each one of them is having a probability of M, then it will be M times M times M, which is the M cube times the H. That is the probability of opening up of the gates permitting the current to flow. And similarly, since there are 4 types of N gates, so it is N into N into N into N, so it is N to the power 4. So that's what is the GNA and GK. Now M, H, N, these are having their own rate constant. So they have a simple kinetics which will be covered in the second equation, that is the gate kinetics equation, in which we will be talking about dm dt, that is the rate of change of this gate type M, then dn dt and dh dt. Now I told you also earlier that this depends on 2 things. One is what? For let's say for the first gate kinetics, for the opening up of the M type of gates, it will depend on alpha M, which is of course intrinsically a function of the voltage itself. So it is alpha M, where alpha M will be the typical rate constant corresponding to M, and 1 minus M. So 1 minus M is the probability that these M gates will be opened, and then the opposite probability that it will be closed will be related to beta M times M, where beta M also is intrinsically a function of Vm. So similarly, there for N gate you need alpha N beta N, and similarly for the H gate you need alpha H beta H, which means in order to solve this you need to have the 6 sets of coefficients. So these are 3 pairs. So you need these 6 constants, and these 6 constants are actually experimentally determined. So this is something we have to keep in our mind. So once we know these 6 constants, then we can go back to this equation and we can find out that what is GNA, because then we know GNA 0, MH we can find out, and similarly we can find out GK, and we can put it back to this equation in order to get the membrane current. So this is first of all the electrical part of the equation. If we now look into the H-H model cable equation, then you can see here that in the cable equation we can actually keep the spatial variation of the membrane voltage. So we can equate the spatial rate of change of the spatial variation of the membrane voltage with the membrane current by using the cable equation. So essentially what this cable equation does is that, let us say we have a soma and which has some dendrites, let's say, and that's the soma, and from that soma let us say we have the action. So let's say this is the action going, and which will be ending to some synapse. Now this action is essentially modeled like a cable, and the radius of this cable, so essentially this part, it is this part which is modeled like a cable of some radius A. So this is the cable. So let us see, this is the cable, and the radius of the cable is modeled as A. That's one thing. And the other thing here is this internal resistance. So this internal resistance is the resistance inside this cytoplasm of these axons. So this internal resistance, let's say that is denoted as Ri. So if the internal resistance is Ri, and this cable radius is A, then the cable equation, which essentially considers that there is this continuous membrane which is continuously between different points of nodes of RAN VA. It can be actually segmented in terms of what you call a kind of electronic systems. Okay, so in terms of, let's say, some voltage and these resistance and the capacitance of the IF itself. So then if any one of this system can be modeled separately, and then if you actually get the differential of it, then you will be coming to this particular equation, which will equate between the membrane current and the voltage of the membrane. Now membrane current, already we know that the membrane current itself can be written in terms of the current across the capacitance, and then across the sodium channels and across the potassium channels. The leakage part is not considered, it's just neglected here, but you can include that. So this is what, if you substitute the IM from the earlier relationship, that means that we have done in equation 1. So if you substitute it here, you are going to get this complete relationship, which is giving you the relationship between the spatial rate of change of the voltage, membrane voltage, with respect to the temporal rate of change of the membrane voltage. Okay, so the spatial versus temporal, but yet you can see here that we still have the spatial variable and the temporal variable here. Ideally speaking, we would actually like to get an equation which will be completely in terms of the temporal variable. Now that can be done, of course, so that is what we will be talking about in the next equation, where we talk about the unified action for the action potential. And here what we do is that we acknowledge the fact that the pulse is the action pulse can be actually modeled in terms of a wave equation. So essentially, if you remember that the action pulse, if we try to model it, it is something like this, that there is this time t, and then there is this membrane voltage, which will be basically starting, say for example, from a negative state, cross the threshold, go to a peak, and then it will again come down, and then it goes back. So that's something like this, and this is the part which you remember is the depolarization part. That's the depolarization part of it, and this is the part which is the repolarization part. That's the repolarization. I'm just abbreviating it as RP, and this is the part which is the hyperpolarization part of it, right? So this kind of a signal. Now if you look at the action, so let us say this is what is my action, which is modeled like a cable, and then this action at different points, if you look at it, you will see that this signal is actually the nature of the signal, and also the amplitude is remaining the same. Okay, so there are these nodes of RAN VAs in between, which actually compensate of the intensity losses, but this is how it happens, and this is the way the signal will propagate, and the velocity of this wave velocity is what is theta here. Okay, so then you can actually correlate between the voltage variation with respect to time and the voltage variation with spatial variation of the voltage. So once we have this relationship, all we need to do is to replace the left side as where it was dou 2 Vm dou x2 by 1 over theta square dou 2 Vm dou t2. So this part of it, and also from the left hand side of the earlier equation, we have just taken that 2Ri by A and we brought it in the left hand side. So it becomes A by 2Ri times 1 over theta square, then dow to Vm dow T2, which equals to this current part of it, that is Cm dV dt, dVm dt, then the conductance related, that sodium and the potassium current. So this is what you will get the final cable equation. By solving this, as you can see now that this equation, it has been possible to bring everything with respect to the time domain variation. Of course, it is a nonlinear equation because the GNA itself depends on M and M itself has a rate dependence, etc. But you can still get the entire equation with respect to the temporal variation, and that is a good point. So it is easier to solve this kind of equation in order to get the action potential of the system. We now will talk about the properties which are actually unexplained by the H-H model. For example, we know that as the action potential actually crosses the action, there is a change in the thickness and in the change in the length variation, under the influence of the action potential. Also, we know that the mechanical stimulus can actually actuate the action potential, whereas the electrical model cannot explain that. Also, during the first phase of the NART pulse, heat is released from the membrane and it is reabsorbed during the second phase. Now, if this entire neuronal system is like a resistor, then it will only dissipate the energy. It will not release the heat and reabsorb it, just like an adiabatic and reversible phenomenon. So that is something that also is not possible. So these are some of the important things which are not explained by the H-H model, and hence this drives us to think of a better model towards explaining these facts as well. Now, when we will talk about the development of a new model, consider first of all that it is based on the wave equation, because we already know that the wave equation is there in place. However, in this case the wave velocity is c, that is fine, and the x that we had earlier discussed is actually z here. So z or x, they are similar. So this is the longitudinal direction of the action that we are talking about. So that's what is the z direction. Please keep in mind, just the symbols vary, but that part is the same. Whereas now this variation actually depends on something called del rho A. And what is this del rho A? That is the change in the lateral density of the membrane. This is something that is experimentally observed, that the membrane density, that is if you consider that the neuron itself is like a membrane, there are these, that's the of some thickness, okay, and then I also told you that this membrane changes in the thickness direction as the action wave propagate. Now let us say that that change is creating a change in terms of the variation of the area density, and that variation of area density is del rho A. Then the wave equation I can write in a different way here now as dow T dow T2 of del rho A, and that is if provided if the c square does not vary. Of course it varies along the length because of some other chemical changes inside the system, but it is essentially c square dow to dow j of del rho A. So you look at it carefully, that in the last expression, what was it? It was with respect to the membrane voltage, right? So the last equation was, the wave equation was with respect to the membrane voltage. Now we say no, we are going to go to something more fundamental, and we are going to look into it in terms of the membrane change of the area density of the membrane, and in terms of that we are defining the wave equation. That's the change A we have to keep in our mind. Secondly, in the last equation we said that theta is not varying with respect to the length, but now we are telling no, the C is actually varying with respect to Z. It is not constant. In fact, the C itself has a kind of a dispersion relationship. That means C square is something like C0 square plus it. So it varies with the density and some constant of it, and it's a nonlinear variation with respect to the area density. So if I put our model like this, then I can actually put this expression of C in this entire thing. So we get this final model, and what we will see is that in this final model, because of the dispersion, we will get an additional dispersion term here. This is very important. Okay, that is, we get in addition to that the C's variation, because of the dispersion we get an extra variation here. Okay, and this extra variation will be very important. We will look into it soon. Now, certain non-dimensionalization let us do for the model, which means that for the del rho A, we can actually, with respect to the equilibrium lateral density, let us have a variable u, then let us have x as a non-dimensional variable now with respect to the thickness, and then let us have the time itself as another non-dimensional variable, and we have these two constants b1 and b2. So this is the thing that we will require to non-dimensionalize the last equation. So if I do that, and here the h is a parameter which describes the frequency dependence of the speed of sound. Okay, so if I do that, we are going to get that last equation in a much more neat and clean form, which is that the non-dimensional variation of area density is now u. So that is dou to u dou to t2 will be dou x of these velocity itself is with respect to a new non-dimensional quantity b. So it is like dou x of bu dou x, and then that h factor is accommodated here in, we get this relationship, the dispersion part of it as minus dou 4u dou x4, and the bu you can take up to two terms as 1 plus p1u plus p2u square. So this is how we can actually get this whole expression in a non-dimensionalized mode. Now, if I get this whole expression in a non-dimensionalized mode, the only thing now is that we can actually apply another parametrization in terms of the density pulse. We can use a coordinate transformation now, and we can put a new coordinate zeta, which is x minus beta t, where beta will be the dimensionless propagation of velocity. So we can get the new equation in terms of not in terms of x, but in terms of beta square dou to u dou xi 2 as dou xi of bu dou u dou xi minus dou 4u dou xi 4, which is what is the dispersion part. Again, we have to keep in our mind that this dispersion, if it is not there, then the system will be a conservative system and it will not give you the relationship which is very important for us in terms of the propagation of the wave. So the analytical solution of this density propagation, if you solve this equation, you will get it in this u xi in terms of two constants a1, a plus and a minus, where a plus and a minus can be expressed in terms of the b1, b2s, beta zeros. So we'll get it, and the beta itself, please keep in mind that it's a non-dimensional velocity which generally varies between 0.6 to 1. Now we will see something very interesting in terms of the behavior of the beta. We will see that this solution actually takes us to a very well-known wave solution, which is in terms of solitons. Well, the solution in that last equation will actually give you what I was just telling you, that a soliton. Okay, and what is a soliton? It's a self-reinforcing solitary wave packet, and which will maintain its shape. Remember, the action potential maintains its shape while it propagates at a constant velocity. Imagine that this is what is the direction of the action potential. So there is a soliton that is propagating. If that wave equation, if we solve, that will give us a soliton. And these are caused how? By a cancellation of nonlinear and dispersive effects in the medium. That's why I said that the dispersive effect is important, because it is going to cancel out the nonlinear part. Now, solitons are the solutions of a widespread class of weakly nonlinear dispersive PDEs, okay, describing the physical system. As far as in 1834, John Scott Russell observed first a solitary wave in a canal in Scotland, and it is only lately, the researchers like Hamburg's, Jackson's, they have found out that in terms of the neuronal voltage, such a solution actually matters. Now let's look into that. How does a soliton actually behaves? I will take you through a small animation from University of Tasmania and of the Scott Forest. I'll show you the video which will explain you beautifully that how does a soliton propagates. Let us look into the soliton wave.
Solitons are a complex hydrodynamic phenomenon.
It's a water
they are
channel
rarely observed in
happening,
typical operating
channel,
conditions,
so you can
and require
visualize,
several
and the
key
flow is
factors
happening,
for their
and
generation.
you can see that there
Solitons
is
are generated by a vessel operating at critical fluid depth
control the
in a restricted waterway, such as in a channel.
That it is generating as
Upon generation, solitons travel ahead of the vessel at supercritical speeds
in the canal,
and have a form such that they can travel
so
large distances with little change in speed or amplitude if the conditions remain consistent. Here we can see a towed model in a channel traveling in the transcritical fluid depth region that was continuously generating solitons. The maximum speed of a wave is limited by the depth of the water it is traveling in. The deeper the water, the faster the wave can travel. This allows tsunamis to travel at very high speeds across deep oceans.
And there is a
fluid depth is a relationship between vessel speed and the depth of the water. If a vessel is traveling at a critical fluid depth of 1, it is going the maximum speed of the waves it is generating. A vessel operating in the subcritical fluid depth region, which is less than a fluid depth of approximately 0.7, will produce what is known as a Kelvin wave. The subcritical region is where the majority of vessels operate, as few have the power to overcome the resistance encountered in the transcritical region. Vessels that operate in the supercritical region, however, must pass through the transcritical and critical regions, and when a fluid depth of 0.7 is exceeded, the wake begins to diverge away from the vessel. As a vessel approaches a critical fluid depth of 1, it produces a wave of translation due to the maximum wave speed. If this energy is contained, such as in a channel, it will continuously disperse ahead of the vessel in the form of soliton waves.
And the soliton, look how it is propagating. The soliton is simply propagating without any destruction or disturbance. So
whilst generating solitons, the vessel also undergoes a dynamic oscillatory response. Shown here is the dynamic trim of the model, fluctuating as each soliton generates.
This is something that happens during the tsunami also. So we can say that something like a tsunami that happens in our blood every time this action potential is actually happening. Now, of course, there is one point that what happens when two solitons will collide from the opposite direction. Then in such a case, it actually there is a blocking of it that you can see that as this is what is the before the collision, these two waves are approaching, you can see. Okay, this is something that is still is to be actually checked with respect to the nerve impulse, and you can see what is happening if post collision, and that's what is the post collision part of it. Okay, so you cannot see either of the solitons here. Now if you use on the other hand a simpler form of collision, which is a Hodgkin-Huxley equation, which is Piezoelectric equation, then two pulses traveling in opposite directions before and after, you can see that you may see that the pulses are going to annihilate after the collision. Whereas for these kind of a system, this kind of annihilation does not actually happen. They can actually pass through each other. So that is something that is still not explainable through the soliton model. So you can see that this is what is happening for a soliton, that two solitons are approaching, and you can see that after their collision, they are actually with a much lesser amplitude, but they are just going back to both the directions. So this is something that does not happen in this particular case, whereas in the case of the simpler version of the H-H model, that is the Hodgkin's, that is the Piezoelectric model, you can see that there is a complete annihilation that is happening. So the point is that these Hodgkin-Huxley model predicts a complete annihilation of two waves, whereas for soliton collision this does not happen. Now in reality, that means the action potentials in terms of waves, if it reflects back from the synapse, then it will once again pass through without this these proceeding directions, the propagation direction of the action wave, and both of them will come down, but there will be no annihilation. On the other hand, in the last model we have seen that there will be an annihilation. So that disparity is still existing in the system. Does soliton model support anesthesia? Well, that is another point, that it is known that well known that general anesthetics actually lowers the melting point of the lipid membrane, and you know that the neuronal membranes are actually of lipid membrane. So reduction of melting point because of these drugs or anesthetics, that means that there has to be an increase of the required pressure to generate the density wave, and that means that these density waves will not be able to get generated so easily. So in the presence of anesthesia, the free energy requirement will increase, which will inhibit the soliton formation, and that explains that why an anesthesia would work. In fact, there is an experiment that Heimberg's group have carried out where the ambient pressure level of a tadpole which is under anesthesia, that is increased to about 50 bar pressure, and they found that the effect of anesthesia is overcome, okay, and the tadpole is able to move again. So thus the soliton model provides a mechanism for general anesthesia. That is something that happens in terms of the soliton model. Let us now carry out a brief summary between the Hodgkin-Huxley model and the soliton model, and let's try to see that where we are with respect to both the models. As I told you that both the models are partially successful in explaining something and in not explaining something, so which may actually generate further scope of research in this field. In the H-H model, we can see that the action potential is based on the electrical cable theory, in which the pulse is the consequence of voltage and time dependent changes of the conductance of sodium and potassium. So it is purely electrical in nature. The model is consistent with quantized ion currents, that is proved. It is consistent with the channel blocking effects also of several poisons such as tetrodotoxin. This model is based on ion currents through resistors. That's a problem because it is therefore dissipative in nature. The reversible changes in heat and mechanical changes are not explicitly addressed, but heat generation would be expected. But why the heat is reabsorbed, that is not explained. And the model generates a refractory period. On the other hand, for the Soliton model, which is a newer model, the nerve impulse is considered to be an outcome of electromechanical Soliton wave that is coupled to the lipid transition in the membrane. And the solitary character is considered to be a consequence of the nonlinearity of the elastic constants. It, of course, doesn't contain an explicit role of poisons and protein ion channels. So that is something that is to be checked still. And the theory is consistent with channel-like pore formation in lipid membranes. That part is consistent. And the temperature part, and it does not dissipate heat, but it actually shows the whole model as an adiabatic process. So that is something that happens. Of course, it still doesn't explain the change in terms of the thickness, for which possibly we need a more refined model. In order to look into a more refined model, we have to first know that the bilayer lipid membrane, that is basically there in the neuronal walls. So if you consider the neuronal wall, each wall of this neuronal wall is actually consist of bilayer lipid membranes. Okay. Now these bilayer lipid membranes, they are known to be piezoelectric in nature. Now the ionic motion, whether the piezoelectricity is happening due to electroactive polymer or due to ionic motion, that is something we need to still focus on. I have already told you about the characteristics of electronic EAPs and ionic EAPs when we have discussed about these kind of things in terms of active muscles. So in electronic EAP, like dielectric EAPs, electrostick tip papers, ferroelectric polymers, or liquid crystal elastomers, these are all electronic EAPs, and they are capable of actually these kind of motions, but it is slightly slower. On the other hand, ionic EAPs like ionic polymer gels, IPMCs, conductive polymers or CNTs, they are actually faster. So they are faster and these are slightly slower. So because this nerve impulse is happening in the millisecond region, so this is millisecond region, so that kind of tells that it could be because of these things. So this I need to change. So this is ionic EAP, so this part is slower. So ionic EAPs are slower, okay, and this is faster. The electronic EAPs, this is faster. So because of these millisecond region, this actually short up tells us that maybe this phenomenon is because of the electronic EAPs, which are actually faster in nature. It is also possible that this kind of a thing is actually happening because of an electrothermomechanical system. If you consider the bilipid layer, people have shown through experiments that the lipid layer can be actually modeled in terms of piezoelectric system. So then it will be electrothermomechanical system, because any piezoelectric system consists of three things together. So there is this piezoelectric effect, and there is this pyroelectric effect, and there is the mechanical effect. So that's why there is the temperature comes in the pyroelectric effect, and the voltage comes in the piezoelectric effect, and the mechanical force occurs. So all the three things together can be actually observed in this type of phospholipid layers. So that may actually verify the piezoelectric nature of the liquid crystal. Now, this kind of piezoelectric nature will also show that there is a frequency dependent and a temperature dependent variation, as you can see here. that the electric polarization P is actually varying with respect to the frequency of propagation and with respect to temperature, both. So this is something like a bilayer system, lipid system with a potassium channel protein, and you can see the lipid layer and you can see the potassium channel proteins. So this is something that is still to be explained, that how this entire dynamics of the movement of the potassium through the bilayer lipid layer happens with the help of the piezoelectricity. Now, as I told you about the piezoelectricity, that the electronic polarization in piezoelectricity is very fast in terms of the frequency, 10 to the power 12 Hz, ionic is about 10 to the power 9 Hz, dipolar is 10 to the power 6, and space charge is even slower, 10 cube Hz or 1000 Hz or in the kilohertz level. So accordingly the response time is going to be varying. The response time will be more here, so this will be more here, the response time, and the response time will be very, very less here. Now depending on what type of a polarization is happening in the lipid layer, we will be able to actually say that what type of polarization is happening in the lipid layer. So if we consider an action to have this kind of a patches of piezoelectric patch, then what will that motion predict? So here is an equation of motion, as you can see, which is different from the earlier two equations that we have seen, because now we have the longitudinal displacement ux, the spatial variation of it with respect to the wave number, and we can get the equation and this longitudinal displacement, and similarly you can also get for thickness wise displacements, but these changes are happening because of the piezoelectricity that is there in the piezoelectric patches. So in every piezoelectric patch you will see this kind of a change that is happening in the system, and that can also generate a kind of a pulse in the system. So in order to solve this wave equation, I can actually use a traditional transfer function matrix. So where you actually put all the longitudinal displacements in terms of a state vector, and you can develop the transfer function, and you can find out the impedance and the wave constants, and you can actually solve this in terms of finding out the wave propagation of the system. The interesting thing that you will note from this is that there will be in such a system invariably certain bands where the wave constants will be actually real in nature, whereas certain bands where it will be imaginary in nature. So these are the plot of the real and the imaginary parts. Now real part of the propagation constant actually is telling that there is a kind of a pass band. So this is a pass band, okay, and this is a pass band. So there are two pass bands. There is a very small pass band here. Whereas wherever the imaginary constant will come into picture, then you may say that there are these stop bands which will be there. So the creation of the pass band and the stop band is actually telling us that only certain frequencies are allowed through these channels and certain frequencies are not allowed through these channels. Now based on this piezoelectric model and our earlier knowledge, there is a new model which is coming up, which is called a co-propagation model. I'll just very briefly, for your reference, I'll mention this model to you. In the case of a co-propagation model, which is something like an advanced version where the piezoelectricity is considered, you can see that it is considering a minimal mechanical model of the action, which has an elastic and a dielectric tube filled with viscous fluid, and the action potential as it is passing it changes the charge separation across the dielectric membrane because the thickness change, and that is altering the membrane's geometry, and that will create the electrical voltage. So there is a co-propagation of displacement because that voltage will again change the thickness. So there is a co-propagation of displacement wave along with the electrical pulse. So this theory is telling that there will be, let's say, with respect to time, there will be a voltage change, that will be a voltage pulse. So there will be a voltage pulse, and also with respect to time, as well as with respect to the direction of propagation, there will be something like a displacement change. So that also will be happening, and they will be actually co-propagating both the models. So this is checked with the Garfi's olfactory nerve, that there is this voltage propagation and the change in the membrane displacement. Both are happening. And you can also see that there is a mechanical heat that is happening, and there is a change in the temperature increase and decrease. Similarly, the same thing is obtained from squid giant action, hippocampal neuron. In all the cases, they see that there is a membrane displacement and that's happening, and there is a lateral displacement that's happening in the system. I will now show you a typical simulation where you can see that how this wave can propagate. Imagine this is what is your action. So you can see first that how this radial propagation of wave is happening. It's starting from one point, how it is happening, okay? And similarly, you can see that how in axial direction also the wave is propagating. This is where it's axially it is propagating. So thus it is actually possible to propagate the wave both in the radial and in the axial direction under two different frequency bands. Now this is where we'll put an end. In the next lecture, we will talk about different types of the ways experimentally how we can actually obtain the electrical signals from the brain, which is very important from the human-robot interaction point of view. Thank you.